All right, we're on chapter 13 of my autobiography, My Mother's Death. Subsection 1 is entitled Bank Robbing 101. I was having a hard time grieving over the loss of Mary yet again. This time, though, it felt permanent. It wasn't, and I was drinking heavily. I was frequenting a couple of bars every night near my mother's house, a biker bar called The Trough, and a bar at the local bowling alley right across the street, Mesa East Bowl. At the biker bar, I was surrounded by bikers with leather jackets and huge, heavy-set truck drivers. I would sit at the bar and drink whiskey and beer, and occasionally chat with whoever was sitting next to me. If I got drunk enough to lose my self-consciousness, then I would shoot a game of pool with one of the bikers or else flirt with the ladies. One night I got so drunk that I actually found myself on the dance floor, and I can't really dance. Found myself on the dance floor with a woman about my age and danced through several pop songs with her. We were the only two people dancing. It must have been a sight. At the bowling alley, which was more convenient because I didn't have to drive back drunk, I would sit at the bar and drink beer while watching the large-screen television above the bar. I was sitting at that bar the night the Las Vegas shooter fired over 1,100 rounds into a crowd at a country western concert. About a week prior to that event, though, I had had a few drinks at that bar and then walked back across the street to my mother's house around 7 p.m. I was very, very drunk. I walked in and opened the refrigerator to get a bite to eat and thought I heard my mother yelling, which was not unusual. She was always yelling, at me, at my brother, at her cats, so I shrugged it off and went out to the garage in a stupor and collapsed on my bed and went straight to sleep. A few minutes later, my brother knocked on the garage door, loudly. He then opened the door and turned on the garage light. "Hey, John," he said nervously, "you better get out here. Something's happened to Mom." We went into her bedroom and found her lying face down on the floor, wedged in between the narrow space between her bed and the wall. She was still alive, but only just barely. We tried to wrestle her up, but there was no room to maneuver in that tight space. Frantically, we called the paramedics, and they showed up in a few minutes and took her away. We went to the hospital, but the prognosis was grim. She most likely would not make it through the night. My brother and I took one last look at her nearly dead body on the gurney, and we knew we would never see her again. She was 68 years old. Apparently what had happened is that she had been asleep all day long. She'd been sleeping for longer and longer periods due to being put on new meds, and just after dark she had gotten up to go to the bathroom. But she didn't turn on any lights except for the bathroom light. On her way back to the bed in the dark, she collapsed from septic shock and fell forward into that space. Months earlier, she had broken her foot and not realized it because the circulation of blood to her feet was a problem. She had swollen ankles due to heart disease. She had somehow banged her foot up against the heavy metal frame of her bed and broken it in several places. By the time she found out about it, the doctors were already discussing the possibility of amputating her foot. She had developed an infection in that foot, and it would not heal. So the infection spread and eventually became septic, and she had simply collapsed. Her diabetes had been quite advanced by that point also. She had a sugar addiction that would not quit. Sugar was her main drug. Every night, she consumed large amounts of ice cream, cake, and pie, and no matter how much my brother and I warned her about it, she would always just wave her hand and say, "Leave me alone, yeah. So she wasn't going to live long, no matter which way you sliced it. But now the reality of our financial situation began to settle and creak all around us. Neither one of us was employed, and the mortgage on the house was underwater and unsalvageable. She had taken out a life insurance policy, but it wasn't for all that much, and we weren't sure how long it was going to take to pay out. I had to get sobered up in order to deal with these new and very serious problems. So I checked myself into the same recovery unit at the hospital where my mother had worked. She had quit her job there about 2 years earlier, which had concerned my brother and I because walking up and down those long hallways was the only exercise she ever got. We were pretty certain that her health was going to go downhill much faster once she became almost completely sedentary, and of course we were correct. In the program, there were several of her co-workers who were shocked to learn that she was dead. I was in the hospital for about 5 days while I dried out. One of the patients, whom I hit it off with, was a bank robber. He was a war veteran who had served in Afghanistan, and he had just finished a 7-year sentence for robbing 14 banks. When I asked him why his sentence was for only 7 years for that many banks, he said that it was because the robberies were never armed. "How do you rob a bank without a gun?" I asked. He proceeded to give me the rundown on bank robbing 101, as he termed it. What you do is, you go up to the bank teller and give them a note. The note says, "Put all the money in your drawer into this bag or else all hell will break loose." The teller, he insisted, will definitely comply because they have no idea whether you have a gun or not. The teller would fill the bag, and then he would stride casually out the front door and disappear on foot into the surrounding neighborhood. All these banks were in Phoenix, and he claimed that he had made off with about $70,000 altogether, which he said that he had hidden somewhere and was going to get the money after he finished with rehab. He wanted to be sober for his 10-year-old daughter. My son was 10 years old too, and so every night we began having conversations about our lives. When I recounted to him the story about losing my son and how my abusive stepfather had given me money to pay a lawyer, but then stopped giving it to me, his face darkened. "Where does your stepfather live?" he said grimly. I sensed that this man was likely a very dangerous individual. No, I said, laughing. "Don't worry about it." When I explained to him the precarious nature of my financial situation, he said, "When I get out of here next week, I'll be happy to loan you a couple grand." "I'll think about it," I said, flirting with the idea of forming an alliance with a hardened criminal. But when I got out of the hospital and returned to my mother's house, my brother informed me that my mother's life insurance had come through and was on the way. About a week later, the bank robber called me. "You need that loan?" he said, but I politely declined. I knew very well what would happen to me if I was not able to repay that loan. "Okay, but the offer stands. Listen," he said, "I've got a guy who's going to hire me as a restaurant manager at a place out in Globe." Globe was about a 2-hour drive east of my mother's house. It was located out in the deep Arizona desert, not very far from Superior, the town in which Oliver Stone had set his movie U-Turn. He paused a moment, then said, "You want in?" Suddenly I found myself cast in a minor role in Goodfellas. I once again politely declined and told him that I wished him well. I made sure never to answer another phone call from him again. Later, when I asked a medium about him, she said, "Run the other way. He's not giving you the full story." 2. In which the brothers Ebert interview their first medium. Now, I had already learned by this point that it was possible to hire a medium to contact dead relatives, but I had never experimented with it before. And now here was the opportunity. Mom was dead, and I wanted to talk to her. Both my brother and I felt extremely guilty about the circumstances of her death. Neither one of us had been home when she fell, and both of us suspected it might have been our fault. I wanted to know what Mom thought. So I went to Bob Olson's website, where he has a listing of psychic mediums that he regards as reputable and trustworthy. Olson had been a hard-nosed, cynical private detective whose father had died, and it traumatized him so much that he had eventually resorted to using a medium to talk with him. He finally found one that could channel him. His dead father relayed intimate details back to him that the medium could not possibly have known, and that convinced him of the reality of the other side. I found a medium on his website and called her up to schedule a time to talk with my mother. The medium said, "She's here with me right now. She says she misses you guys, but doesn't." Does that make sense? It sure did. But the medium said that it was too early to talk with her and that we needed to wait a couple of weeks for her to get acclimated to the other side. So we set a date for the end of October. 5 days after my mother died, her mother Dorothy then died of Alzheimer's. We had been expecting my grandmother to die any day, so it was no surprise, but when my brother and I sat down at the end of October to talk with the medium, she said that both our mother and our grandmother were there with her. That's funny. I never mentioned to the medium anything about my grandmother dying, so that was something she could not possibly have known. The medium then said that a third individual was also present who wished to remain unidentified. We first asked our mother about her death and how we both blamed ourselves for not getting to her in time, but our mother said that it wouldn't have mattered as she would have died of a blood clot 5 days later, that same day, note that my grandmother died. Then the medium explained to us that our mother and her mother had planned to go out at the same time, since they liked being together on the other side and were inseparable. A phenomenon which I'm calling cosmic twins. Keep that phrase in mind for the next chapter. When I asked if she had had any contact with her third husband, Bob, the medium said, "No, because he isn't here. He's in some kind of limbo." And she confirmed that he was indeed haunting the house. "He watches you guys sleep at night," she said, which creeped me out. Then when I asked if my mother had had any contact with her dead father, the rocket scientist who had committed suicide, the medium said, "He's actually the third party here who wanted to remain in the background." I then proceeded to ask him if he regretted his suicide, and to my astonishment, he said that he did not, and that it had been the right decision for him to make. The dead are always so blunt, and I appreciate that about them. After discussing some other personal matters, we concluded the interview, and both my brother and I were relieved. Her death had not been our fault. It had simply been her time to go. There was nothing we could have done to save her. Subsection 3. Conversations with dead philosophers. After the life insurance money came through, we split it down the middle. Then we started discussing what to do about the house. Our mother had advised us during the interview to just walk away and let it go. My brother was going to move to an apartment back in North Phoenix, his favorite place to live, and I was already making plans to move to Santa Fe. We were just going to walk. Mother had given us her approval, so that was that. Over the next couple of weeks, I would wake up and take my laptop and go sit at the local Starbucks and work on my poetry. And one day, while sitting there drinking my coffee and staring out the window, I started wondering. We had hired a medium to talk to Mom. Was it possible that I could hire a medium to interview my favorite dead thinkers? As far as I knew, no one had ever done such a thing. The very idea was preposterous, and that's why I liked it. Without audacity, you don't discover anything new. You have to have balls and take risks, or you just repeat stereotypes and cliches. I was fully aware of the website called Channeling Eric, in which Elisa Medus used mediums to interview her dead son, Eric, a 20-year-old bipolar kid who had shot himself and was now communicating with his mother, who had been an atheist materialist physician before her son's death. They had already interviewed all kinds of dead celebrities, which I watched at first feeling silly and gullible. They had interviewed Hitler. They had interviewed Jesus Christ, the Buddha, Robin Williams. Not possible, I thought. There's simply no way. These interviews must somehow be fake. But then came the interview with Howard Hughes, a man whose life I knew in very great detail, as I had written a chapter on him in my book, Dead Celebrities, Living Icons. The first medium which Elisa used was a young millennial, most likely someone who had never even heard of him. But when they started talking to him, I knew right away that it was really him. There were simply too many details the medium was relaying about his life and childhood for it to have been otherwise. People who are skeptical of these interviews say to me, well, the medium could have pulled up a page on Wikipedia and studied up on him. But the thought of all these mediums, which Elisa had been using, and there are a lot of them, frantically rushing to Wikipedia or YouTube to study up on all the obscure details of these people's lives and remember them, is not only comical, but absolutely ludicrous. People will do and say anything, absolutely anything, to defend a worldview once they have settled upon it, especially if they have done so early in life, because shedding one's worldview is an experience that is almost equivalent to dying. If you're a materialist, you tend to remain a materialist. If you're an atheist, you tend to stay that way unless something comes across your path, usually something traumatic, to shatter your world. And my world has been shattered so many times that I've actually gotten used to it being the norm for my life. So now I wanted to know if I could find a medium to interview Oswald Spengler, the author of The Decline of the West, my all-time favorite book. I then emailed Elisa Medus, asking her if she would consider it, but she said she didn't know anything about philosophy, and that I should contact one of the Channeling Eric mediums listed on her website. So I went to her site and sent emails to a few mediums, most of whom were either uninterested or else too booked up with clients to do it. But then I encountered the medium named Shruti Campbell. She was just starting out on her career as a medium, and though she said she didn't know anything about philosophy, she was intrigued by the idea and said that she would be willing to give it a shot. She was a computer programmer living in London who had been born and raised in India and had only been living in the UK for about 5 or 6 years. She was Buddhist and didn't know much about the other religious traditions of India, particularly Hinduism, which she didn't care for because of its support of the caste system. But she had only just recently discovered her mediumship abilities by traveling a path that was similar to mine, in that she also had started by binge-watching near-death experience videos on YouTube that convinced her of the reality of the afterlife. She too, and at just about the same time as I was discovering all this in Boulder in my mid-40s, had discovered the Channeling Eric website, and had been working her way through those videos when the spirit of Eric actually contacted her and encouraged her to leave her day job as a computer programmer in order to channel the spirits full time. She was reluctant, however, and put up with a lot of skepticism from her family. At the time I contacted her at the end of 2017, she was still working her day job and was hesitant to make the full leap into channeling. So we set a date for sometime in early November. We then met on Skype for the first time, and she told me that Eric was there with us. I said hello to him, and he told me to my surprise that he was a big fan of my work, and that he liked the way I think. I was flattered. I'd never heard compliments from a dead person before. Eric then went to go fetch Oswald Spengler. We spent the next hour asking him all sorts of detailed philosophical questions. By the end of the interview, I was convinced that it was actually him. Why? More of a feeling than anything else. Skeptics of our work point out that sometimes these dead philosophers say things that individual would never have said, or sometimes the ideas don't come through with the same eloquence and clarity as when they were alive. To which I would answer by pointing out the following. 1. Sometimes the dead, when they get to the other side, change their minds about beliefs or ideas they had held while alive. Joseph Campbell had been an atheist materialist, but when we interviewed him, the first question I asked was whether he had been surprised to wake up on the other side. His reply, "I sure was." So there's that. 2, Shruti knows absolutely nothing about philosophy, but I prefer her to be naive about the ideas so that she doesn't interject her own interpretations. This means, however, that she has to translate ideas for which she does not have the concepts into her own language as best she can. And English is her second, not her primary language, which is Hindi. 3, mediumship is not an exact science. Sometimes she cannot quite make out what the spirits are saying to her. Some things get lost in translation, as is always the case when you translate the content of one medium into another. Poetry is famously untranslatable for that very reason. You're not going to have all the same ideas come through in a poem in English as you would, let's say, in the original German. 4, Shruti is not clairaudient. That is to say, she does not actually hear their voices as other mediums do, but rather receives what she calls thought blocks or images or feelings, which she has to use her own intuition to translate. So the whole process isn't exactly like a Bill Moyers interview. There are kinds of nuances and ambiguities that have to be taken into account. But as far as I'm concerned, the personalities of these thinkers do indeed come across very well. When we interviewed Arthur Schopenhauer, true to his generally misanthropic personality, he said that he didn't really want to do the interview, but that he would do it anyway as a favor. Friedrich Nietzsche's cheerfulness, playfulness, and manic energy also came through very clearly, as did Joseph Campbell's polite enthusiasm, and so forth. And finally, to respond to one other question, how can we interview anyone we want if some of these individuals have current incarnations running on the planet, or other planets for that matter, below? And what I've learned regarding that is rather astonishing, namely that the higher self usually has multiple incarnations running simultaneously on Earth as well as on other planets. I asked the medium who told me this whether Mary and I have incarnations running right now on other planets, and she said yes. Do we have romantic entanglements on these other planets? Answer, yes. That is mind-blowing. The mechanics of how all this works I have not yet sufficiently grasped to articulate it, but apparently the paradigm in the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once is not far off the mark. So, with our first interviews, we were off and running. And then one morning, during the first week of December, I woke up before dawn and knew that it was time to go to Santa Fe. My mother's house was depressing and full of bad energy. I didn't want to be there anymore, as it now felt oppressive and gloomy like some old cast-off pale shell. So I packed up as many belongings into my car as I could, and then got in and drove up the mountain to the small, salmon-colored town. And there it is. That's the center of Santa Fe, the spiritual center from which it grew, and remains to this day an axially rooted town with no skyscrapers, no Fortune 500 companies, no air pollution, or at least very little. And it's just a very human, livable place to be. I've been here for 7 years now, and I love the place. So, and it's culturally oriented. The Native Americans have been here for at least 1,000 years, probably more. So it's got very long traditions. It's technically the second oldest town in North America, the first oldest being St. Augustine, Florida. But I think it's the oldest. That's only counting it from the Spanish conquest for 500 years. They're not counting the prior occupation of it from all the different kinds of Native Americans, Puebloans mostly, and so forth. Okay, we'll leave it there for that. Next time, just to give you a sneak preview here, the next chapter is probably the craziest one yet, because chapter 14, again, Mary. And there she is, looking super hot. 4 years later, it looks like she hasn't aged at all. She still looks 18. That's funny. Okay, we'll get into that next time.